All right, we are diving deep into the world of legal research today. And hey, if you think that just means old dusty books and obscure cases, you are in for a massive surprise. This whole field is going through a massive change, and it's so much more exciting than you might think. So let's just start right at the beginning. When I say the words legal research, what's the first image that pops into your head? Go on, think about it. I'm willing to bet you're picturing someone kind of like this, right? Surrounded by these ancient, leather-bound books, just digging and digging for that one perfect case from like 100 years ago. And yeah, that's the classic image, but honestly, it's just a tiny piece of a much, much bigger puzzle. The reality is way more dynamic. As our source material points out right here, legal scholarship is facing significant transformations. Why? Because our world is so interconnected now. The old maps just don't cover all the new territory. Okay, so where does this journey of ours even begin? Well, it starts with the traditional foundation. This is what's known as doctrinal research, and for a very long time, this was the absolute bedrock of legal study. So this is that classic approach we were just talking about. The whole goal is to find, analyze, and explain what's called black letter law, basically the law as it is written down. The source materials are the laws themselves, statutes passed by legislatures and judgments from the courts. Think of it as just figuring out the official rules of the game, plain and simple. And it is a super structured process. It's almost like a scientific method, but for texts. You kick off with a question. You systematically comb through legal databases. You screen everything you find to make sure it's relevant and still good law, and then you pull it all together into one coherent answer. But here's where things get really interesting. This is the plot twist. What happens when we start asking a totally different question? When we move beyond what the law says and start asking, what does the law actually do out there in the real world? By the end of the 20th century, a lot of scholars were starting to feel like just looking at the books wasn't cutting it anymore. As this quote puts it, they felt a purely doctrinal approach could be intellectually rigid and inward-looking. It just wasn't capturing how the law was really impacting society and actual people's lives. And this slide, it just lays out that shift perfectly. On one side, you have doctrinal research. Let's call it law on the books. And on the other, you have socio-legal research, or law in action. For instance, one study on homelessness didn't just sit and read the Housing Act. Oh no. The researchers went out and collected data, they did interviews, all to see if local authorities were actually applying the law the way they were supposed to. And spoiler alert, they found a huge gap between the rule and the reality. So this new law in action approach, it needed a completely different toolkit. To really measure and understand that gap between the law and everyday life, legal researchers had to start borrowing methods straight from the social sciences. And this chart really drives that point home. A big study of law PhDs in Australia found that the purely traditional, old-school doctrinal work made up only 20% of the projects. Just look at that. The vast majority were using totally different methods, branching out into all sorts of other areas. The entire landscape is changing right before our eyes. Now, inside this new toolkit, you've basically got two main approaches. On one hand, you've got quantitative methods. That's all about numbers, statistics, testing theories on a huge scale. And on the other hand, you have qualitative methods, which are all about exploring the human experience, the why and how, through things like interviews and observation, really aiming for that deep, nuanced understanding. But this new toolkit comes with a new challenge, and it's a big one: the human factor. Because this kind of research, it's not some sterile process happening in a lab. We're talking about real people in messy, totally unpredictable situations. And this is especially true for this really powerful method called ethnographic research. It's a fancy term, but the idea is pretty simple. The researcher just immerses themselves in a community, say a courthouse or a police station, to understand it from the inside. And as this quote makes crystal clear, when you go out exploring, you better be prepared to cope with the unexpected. Get this story from one of the researchers. His original plan was to get a list of suspects and interview them after they were released. But nope, data protection rules shut that down completely. So the police suggested he just hang out in the custody block and talk to people there. And that total accident, that forced change of plans, it led to his absolute best, most original discoveries about what really goes on inside a police station. Okay, for our final stop, we're going to zoom all the way out, from the local police station to the entire global stage. Because here in the world of international law, the very idea of the law changes all over again. See, unlike the national law in your country, there's no single world government just writing down rules for everybody. International law comes out of what this slide calls a decentralized and mainly consensual system. And that means if you're researching it, you have to look for the rules in some very different places. So, where do you even find these rules? Well, according to the statute of the International Court of Justice, this slide is basically your treasure map. These are the four main sources. You've got treaties that countries sign, the customs of how states usually act, general principles of law that are common everywhere, and finally, court decisions and the writings of top experts. So there you have it, from dusty books to big data, from local police stations to the global stage. It is pretty obvious that legal research is anything but static. As our world gets more and more complex, the tools we use to understand its rules have to evolve right there with it. Which really leaves us with one final thought, doesn't it? What new methods are coming next? And what incredible new territories will the next generation of legal researchers get to explore?